So, good evening and welcome to the fourth class of Tradition and Individual Talent. And in this class, as I have said just right now, that I will be giving a brief outline of what I have taught uh, till today morning. And I will give a brief outline rather of section 1 of the essay. So, the very first thing that we have seen in Tradition and Individual Talent, that is the best and the most individual part of the poet's work is that which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past. This is number one that we have seen in the very outset of Tradition and Individual Talent. That is, the most individual and the best part of the writer is not that part which can be isolated from the, the past writers, but it is that part which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past. Now, regarding literary tradition, Eliot says that tradition is not blind adherence to the ways of the previous generation or generations. It is not blind adherence. Second is novelty is better than repetition. He says that following tradition or conforming to tradition doesn't mean that you have to repeat. Novelty is better than repetition. Passive repetition is not tradition. Okay. And it cannot be, and tradition cannot be inherited, but a writer has to achieve or obtain tradition by hard labor. So a writer has to work hard to achieve or obtain tradition, and by hard labor, he comes to know of the past artists and their works. And this labor, Eliot says that it is the critical labor of what? What is this? So this is the labor of what? It is the critical labor of sifting. You know what is the meaning of sifting? That is separating something from another thing. So it is the critical labor of sifting the good from the bad and of knowing what is good and what is useful. So this critical labor, this is what this labor is of sifting the good from the bad and also knowing what is good and what is bad. Now, tradition, Eliot says, cannot be obtained by can be obtained by a historical sense. So Eliot says that tradition can be obtained by historical sense. And what is historical sense? It is a perception not only of the what I have said. I have explained that not only the pastness of the past, but also of its presence. Then he says that the past exists in the present, and the present and the past form one simultaneous order. He says that the past also exists in the present, and the past and the present they form one simultaneous order. So here Eliot says that historical sense is at the same time timeless as well as temporal. Okay. Now the sense of the tradition, according to Eliot, the sense of the tradition implies, you can also note it down if you want, the sense of the tradition implies a recognition of the continuity of literature. So the sense of tradition implies a recognition of the continuity of literature, number one. Number two is a critical judgment. So what is this? The sense of tradition implies, one is recognition of the continuity of literature. Number two, a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present. For knowing this, you need to know all the writers. If you don't know all the writers and what they have written, you won't be able to sift the good from the bad, to sift the significant from the insignificant, to differentiate the good from the bad, to separate the insignificant from the significant. So that's why he says that it is a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present. And third is, so tradition implies a knowledge of these significant writers. So it implies a knowledge of these significant writers obtained through painstaking effort. So three things you need to know: that the sense of tradition implies what? A recognition of the continuity of literature, number one. Number two, a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present, number two. And number three, a knowledge of these significant writers obtained through painstaking effort. So you have to work hard to be a part of this tradition, to be aware of this continuity that is there in tradition. So Eliot says that tradition represents the accumulated wisdom and experience of the ages. This is a very important line. So tradition represents the accumulated wisdom and experience of the ages. So should I repeat this line? It represents the accumulated wisdom and experience of the ages. Now, second, in this next part, we see that he is going towards the discussion of the dynamic conception of tradition. Regarding the dynamic conception of tradition, Eliot says that no writer has value in isolation. So, for doing this, he takes this as a premise that tradition is something which is dynamic. It is not something which is grounded, which is not something which is stable. It is always dynamic. And so he says that no writer has value in isolation. Every writer is part of that continuity of tradition. So what we have to judge his work. While judging his work, what we will do, we will compare and contrast his works with the works of the past. So no writer should be judged in isolation. Whatever a writer is writing, or his contribution should be judged with the compared, it should be compared and contrast with the works of the past. So such comparison and contrast is essential. He says that such comparison and contrast is essential while for forming an idea of the real worth and significance of a new writer and this work. So until and unless you make a comparative and contrastive study of the present writer and his works with the writers of the past and their works, you won't be able to evaluate or ascertain the present value of this writer, the present writer and his work. So this is what Eliot wants to prove, that no writer of the present or of the past can be judged or evaluated in isolation. He or she and his or her work should be judged always in comparison and in contrast to the works of the past. This is the thing. Now, to Eliot, I have said that tradition is something which is dynamic. So tradition is not fixed or static, and it is constantly changing, growing, and becoming different from what it is. So he says that tradition is constantly changing, it is growing, and it is always becoming different from what it is. So a present writer has to do what? He has to conform to that literary tradition. So conforming to that literary tradition doesn't make that writer, this new writer, and his work stable or stagnant or static. But this particular conformity to the tradition, to the continuity of tradition of that literary tradition, that continuity, conforming to that continuity of literary tradition, not only makes the new writer and his work a part of the dynamic process, but also helps to ascertain and helps to evaluate the writer and his work, the position of the writer, and the value of his contribution to that literary tradition. Okay, is it clear now? Now, so what Eliot wants to, what is Eliot's argument here? That the past directs the present, the past influences the present, as well as the present modifies the past. This I have explained in details. So there is, according to Eliot, a sort of reciprocal relationship between the past and the present. The past directs the present and is itself modified and altered by the present. So the past affects the present and is affected by the present. The past affects the present and is affected by the present. So the past directs the present and is itself modified and altered by the present. So every great poet will add something to the literary tradition out of which the future poetry will be written. So whatever a new poet is writing, he is adding something to the existing continuity of literary tradition. So his work, what he is adding, is not only influenced by the past poets and their works, or the past artists and their works, but he, at the same time, his or her work is also altering, modifying, reviewing the past. Now, regarding the function of tradition, Eliot says that the work of a poet in the present, that the work of a poet in the present time is to be compared. So what I taught today, the work of the poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with works of the poets of the past. So the present poet's work should be compared and contrasted, what I told right now. So it should be compared with the works of the past poets and judged by the standards of the past. So you are judging the work of a present poet with the works of the past poets. But when you are judging the work of the present poet in respect of the standards of the past work, there may be some problems. Now here Eliot clarifies this problem, that judgment here does not mean amputation. So when you are amputating something, you are doing what? You are making the something what? That is inactive. That you are just ignoring, you are just just cancelling that work, that this particular work is not fitting into the present norm of judgments that were there, into the past norm of judgment. See, this particular work fails to fit in. Now, Eliot says that that is not true judgment, that you are amputating the work. But judgment here means you should compare and contrast the present work with that of the past. And by comparing and contrasting, you should be aware that the time and climate, that is the time and the climate, the milieu, the ethos, that is very much in vogue when this present writer is writing. If I try to judge the work of an absurdist writer, of an absurd drama, in terms of the norms and the rules that were laid down by the classical writers, so if you judge that blindly, then you are doing what? You are doing injustice to that present work. So while doing that, you need to be aware that while contrasting and comparing a present work of art with that of the past, you need to consider the time, climate, and milieu when this particular work has been written or created. Okay. Standards of the past. But this judgment does not mean determining the work as good or bad. So judgment means you should not be judgmental that this work is good or this work is bad. Telling or labeling something as good and bad, actually it actually shows your shortcoming as a judge. You should not label something as good or bad, because these things are very relative. Now, what you have to do is, when you are judging, you should compare and contrast the pros and cons of this work with the works of the past. You should not judge something as good or bad. It does not mean that the present work is better than the works of the past or vice versa. While you are judging, you should not judge in this way that this particular work is better or worse than the works of the past, or this particular the works of the past, those works were better or worse than this particular work. It is not like that. Judgment should not be like this. It should be a very open-minded, liberal study of compare and contrast. The present author should not be judged by the principles of the past solely. If you solely judge a present author and his work in respect of the principles laid down in the past, you are doing injustice. So that should not be done. This is what Eliot says. Then he says that the comparison is to be made from knowing the facts, all facts about the new work of art. So he says that the comparison, when you are comparing a particular work of art with the past work, you should know all the facts and facets of both the works. Otherwise, you should not compare that. For this, you need what? You need a little bit of erudition. You need a little bit of knowledge about history, about the tradition, and this work also. So he says that is to be made from knowing the facts, all facts about the new work of art. And the purpose of analysis is what? So why you are analyzing this work and making a contrastive and comparative study of this work with the works of the past? For what? You are doing that for better understanding of the new work. So your attitude should not be to disable or amputate the present work, or just cancel the past work as bad or worse, or the present work as bad or worse, or something that should not be taken into consideration. Your attitude should not be like this, but your attitude should be what? While making a judgment, your attitude should be a better understanding of the new work. And this comparison, while you are comparing and contrasting the new work with the past work, that should be a reciprocal study. You should not only judge the whole thing or make the judgment from the perspective of the new work, but you should also judge the whole thing from the perspective of the old work also. So this comparative and contrastive study should be a reciprocal study. So then he goes on to the study of the sense of tradition. Regarding the sense of tradition, he says that tradition does not say that the poet should take the past as a lump. So I told you that the poet should not take the past as a bolus, as a homogeneous bolus or a lump. Why? Because if he takes the past as a homogeneous bolus or a whole, then he is or she is doing injustice to the various facts and facets of the past. So he says that he or she, while judging the past or while studying the past, should give due consideration to the various distinctive features of the past. The past must be examined critically, and only the significant in it must be acquired. So he says that the past should be studied critically, and you should, or the one who is studying should acquire what is significant and useful. Then you will ask me a question that, sir, as you told me that while studying the past, we should be careful about studying all the facts and facets. Then why should we take only the significant part? The fact is that until and unless you study all the facts and facets of the past, how would you be able to understand that these particular aspects or things are significant or useful? So there also you have to study all the things to make a comparative study of their merits and demerits, and then only you will be able to understand, or you will be able to choose what is significantly helpful for me to understand or get a whole idea of the tradition or the continuity of the literary tradition. So he says that the past must be examined critically, and only the significant in it must be acquired. The new poet should not only study a favorite poet or a few favorite poets. So here Eliot points out three areas that generally we find that the new poets commit as errors. One is they take up the past as a insignificant homogeneous bolus that should not be done. Then he says that the new poet should not take up one particular or one or two particular favorite poets. He says that it is it is a mark of immaturity and inexperience. So you may have certain poets or certain works of certain poets who may be favorite to you, or which you find favorite, which you like the most. But to acquire an idea of the tradition, what you need to know is you need to know all the works. Otherwise, how will you be able to know that these particular poets are more significant and useful for me to understand the tradition? So you should not suggestively choose a few favorite poets and their works. Okay. And then he says, neither he or she, that poet, should not be choosy about studying particular ages or particular periods of the literary tradition. He should have an whole, complete, and comprehensive idea of the continuity of literary tradition. He says that this particular choosing of certain periods or ages, that is delightful for the poets or one who is studying, but that is not useful, because then it will go against constituting a sense of the tradition in the mind of the poet. So a sense of tradition means a consciousness of the main current. So a sense of tradition means a consciousness of the main current, and it is to know the tradition of the past, and it should be judging the tradition of the past critically. So what he says is that the sense of tradition means the consciousness of the main current, and to acquire this consciousness of the main current, you need to know the tradition. You need to know the tradition, and the poet must judge critically that tradition to find out which part or which components in that tradition will be helpful for him to understand that tradition. And he or she, the poet who is planning to get an idea of the tradition, should study the main trends also more carefully, more meticulously. But Eliot says that studying more meticulously certain aspects or certain writers or certain periods of the literary tradition doesn't mean that you will skip the other parts. You have to read all the things. You have to be aware of all the significant things that make up the main current of tradition. And then only you will be aware to find out which part or which components in that tradition are significant and they have specific contributions in the literary tradition. So exclusion means what you are seeing or studying the tradition, what incompletely. The incidental or topical things will be excluded later, and after you have a whole idea of the main current of tradition, then only you will go for exclusion of the incidental or topical things. Then he says that the poet must also realize that the main literary trends are not determined by the great poets alone. He says that we have a general tendency to understand or take it as granted that those who are more popular poets, those who are the main poets whom everybody knows, those poets are only the significant contributors to the literary tradition. This is not right. There are many insignificant, unpopular writers also who are also significant contributors to the literary tradition. And Eliot says that to understand, to know of these contributors also, you need to understand, you need to know the whole continuity of literary tradition. And then you will be able to understand the movement, the dynamics of that literary tradition. And he says that don't make the mistake of considering only the popular and the well-known poets or the artists as the main contributors or significant contributors of of the literary tradition. There are many insignificant writers also who are important in their contribution to the literary tradition. Now, a little bit is left. Now, regarding the work of art and its permanence, this part is very important. Regarding the work of art and permanence, Eliot says that art never improves, but its material is never the same. So he says that art is something which never changes, but the materials with which we construct different artifacts or different works of art, that materials, those materials, they change. So he says the mind of Europe may change. He says that the mind of Europe at one point of time, the mind of Europe, they like something different in literature or in or to be more specific in drama, in poetry. So we find that separate poetical tradition during the Elizabethan period, which changed in the Romantic period, and again it changed in the modern period, and so on and so forth in Victorian, and then modern, and so on and so forth. So the literature itself as an identity that never changes, but the components that make up various forms of literary productions, they change. The components change. He says that the mind of Europe may change, but this does not mean that great writers like Homer or Shakespeare have grown outdated. So what Homer wrote, Shakespeare did not write the same thing. Or what Shakespeare wrote, Dryden did not write the same thing. And what Dryden wrote, Wordsworth did not write the same thing. So all of them were adding something to the literary tradition that we find in English literature, or to be more specific, or to be more in general, the European literary tradition. But what Shakespeare wrote or what Shakespeare created, his components are quite different from the components that Wordsworth used, or Dryden used, or Pope used, or Homer used. But we can never say that when we are reading Dryden, or when we are reading Pope, or when we are reading Wordsworth or Browning, that Shelley, that Shakespeare or Homer or Dryden has grown outdated. It is not like that. So literature never improves. It remains always the same, and its magic remains there. But the components with which we form different works of art, that changes. So have grown outdated, and they'll have lost their significance. So there is no, so Eliot says, what he wants to say is that there is no qualitative improvement in art. He says that there is no qualitative improvement in art. There may be refinement. Please note it down. So there is no, what Eliot wants to say is that there is no qualitative improvement in art. There may be refinement, development, but from the point of view of the artist, there is no improvement. But from the point of view of the artist, there is no improvement. The artist, when creates something, he thinks that this is the best thing that I have done. Another artist will create something new with different components. Now you can never dismiss this artist's work or that artist's work as bad or worse, or this should not be taken into consideration. What that artist has created, he has created with specific components, and in a specific time, in a specific space, and amidst a specific milieu. So that particular work is something which is the best and which the artist considers the best. But that particular work has no power to dismiss the other works. So he says that each and every work of art can readjust or modify or review our way of seeing other works, but that doesn't mean that we can say that this particular work is better than that work, or this particular work is worse than that work. You cannot say that. So he says that there is no qualitative improvement possible in art, but there may be refinement. How the first tragedy, that is the tragedy of Ferrex and Porrex, Gorboduc, was written. that way of tragedy writing was refined, that was moderated. But that doesn't mean that we will totally dismiss the first tragedy written in English, Godboduck. Godboduck has its own place in English literary tradition. And the later tragedies that were written by Shakespeare, or the later tragedies that were written by other writers, or the modern tragedies, they all have their own positions, but they cannot dismiss the first English tragedy that was written. So this is what Eliot wants to say. Eliot, so we cannot say while studying two writers in a literary tradition that Eliot is better than Shakespeare or Shakespeare is better than Eliot. We have to study Eliot as per the time, climb, and the milieu when he is writing, and Shakespeare differently. But whenever I am studying Eliot, I have to take into consideration the works of Shakespeare also. I cannot dismiss Shakespeare, or I cannot substitute Eliot's work or dismiss Eliot's work with Shakespeare. Shakespeare has its own place in the literary tradition. Eliot has its own place in the literary tradition. And both are equally important and both influence each other. Shakespeare affects Eliot as well as Eliot affects Shakespeare. Regarding the awareness of the past, he says, Eliot says that criticism of, sorry, so regarding awareness of the past, he says that Eliot says that when I am discussing this thing, that what tradition is and why a writer or a poet should be aware of the tradition and and that writer should acquire a sense of history, he says that these particular things need a certain level of erudition, which some people mistake as just pedantry. That for this, you need so much of learning, so much of knowledge. And there is a general tendency to consider that that when tradition requires erudition, and to be a great poet, a poet has to be aware of the tradition. For that, he needs erudition. There is a common belief that erudition actually tells upon or it destroys the poetic sensibility, but this is not the fact. He says that when we think of erudition, we think of erudition as a very stock thing. That erudition means it is very dry, it has nothing to do with creativity, just like the way we put criticism and creativity in watertight compartments. Eliot says that all these are wrong notions. So erudition doesn't mean that one who is erudite should be very dry, or erudition actually distances you from creativity. Is not like that. He says that, giving the example of Shakespeare, that reading Shakespeare, you will find that you are becoming well aware of Plutarch, and the knowledge that you acquire about Plutarch from reading Shakespeare's plays, that knowledge you won't be able to collect or gather going to the British Museum and studying all the historical documents. So Shakespeare actually used and absorbed more of Plutarch's historical sense in his works, and the viewers or the readers of his play, they can acquire more historical sense from Shakespeare's work than from the British Library. So there is erudition in Shakespeare also, but erudition not in the very commonly believed sense. Okay, so this is the sense. He says, knowledge does not mean merely bookish knowledge. The capacity of acquiring knowledge differs from person to person. So Shakespeare acquired historical sense very naturally and infused them in his work. And that particular thing you won't be able to gather or collect going to the British Museum or from any historical archives. So regarding Shakespeare, he says this and says that erudition is not something which should be dismissed, or which should not be taken into consideration while studying creativity, or when he actually challenges the very idea that erudition tells upon the poetic sensibility. It is not like that. And then at the end, he says, what happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. So at the end, this at the end of the section 1, he now goes on to introduce the impersonal theory of poetry, and there he says that a poet has to negate his own ego or his own personality to have an understanding of the literary tradition, as well as to contribute something significant to that literary tradition. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice. He says that the progress of an artist is what? It is a continual self-sacrifice. It is sacrificing yourself, the negating yourself, a continual extinction of personality. He says that what the progress of an artist is ascertained by his continual extinction of personality. Then he says, there remains to define this process of depersonalization. And he says that now I have to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. Now, here again, we can say that tradition, with tradition and individual talent, Eliot is trying to give the very basic ideas of new criticism, where the poet and his personality is not present in the work that he or she creates. It is so depersonalization is the thing which Eliot wants to establish here. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Now he says that with depersonalization in his own, the author will be able, the poet or the writer will be able to create objectively like the scientist, just like the scientist who takes part in a scientific experiment very impersonally, just negating his personal ego and feeling. Similarly, the poet has to do the same thing. He has to continually negate his personality while creating something. And then he goes on to say that I will now use the example of the role that a platinum cathode or a platinum cathode actually plays in the reaction of the oxygen and sulfur dioxide. Now, sorry, there was an internet disconnection. So he says that the platinum cathode actually works as a catalyst, and that's why it only does what? It only accelerates the process of reaction, but it remains unchanged. Similarly, the poet will also remain unchanged in the whole process of poetic creation. Thank you. Here I will end my class, and I'll let you know when I will take the next class.